Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. This week, Voiceflow. It is a low-code bot creation platform which has a load of really neat AI features in it. One issue that I came across whilst I've been creating a bot for a client is that if you have a lot of canned questions, it becomes very overfacing to the user. How can we keep all the questions, but reduce the number of questions displayed at any one time? My answer to this is what I call a button cycler. So all of these questions that we saw here are actually configured here, although as you can see, we're only seeing 4 of them. But here's the key thing. If I click on, say this one, does a unified theory prove how the universe began? Okay, first of all, it can tell me which button was clicked. But then the next time around, it just picks another question which hasn't been clicked on yet and adds that in. So we're always maintaining 4 buttons in this case, but they change depending on what's been answered already. This means that we can still give the user access to all of the questions that we might have defined in the button logic, but they're not overfaced by a wall of buttons as we are here. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how you can recreate this in your own project. So before we get started, I will add a link to the definition for this bot down in the description. This is the main workflow. So this is the thing which is really just demoing what we're doing. And in order to get this to work, I need to set a variable called JSON URL. Why that is will become clear in a moment. From there, it goes into the component, which is called button cycle. And then as you can see, we can then have a condition block, which, if button selected is this particular ID, we can go off on this flow and so on and so forth. This just gives me a yes or no as to whether or not I want to continue. So let's double click on this here on button cycle, and I can show you exactly how it works. We can see at this step here, it is going off and it is getting that JSON URL that we've specified. Now, what does that look like? It's just a JSON packet with our questions in. For example, what is quantum physics and how does it differ from normal physics? And then it has an answer, which obviously isn't an answer, but it is, or what it needs to be, is a unique ID that is unique within the questions within this file and indeed other files. This is the key by which Voiceflow knows which way to go. So this is the key which Voiceflow will compare, and the component will put in button selected so that we know which button has been clicked and we can send them off to the appropriate flow. Why would I specify this using JSON? This is one step away from using a service like Sheety, for example, which will turn your Google Sheet, in this case, into an API. And what it will do, if you have your sheet set up correctly and Sheety set up correctly, it could return those questions as a JSON packet, as we can see here. So it's not too much of a stretch to imagine that you could give your bot administrator, if you like, perhaps you're the bot administrator, but you could give your customer access to a Google Sheet where they could go in and define the questions themselves, and it wouldn't require your time to update the Voiceflow bot. So let's come back to our component and see what happens next. So this is an API step. So it gets our JSON from the URL. And again, this could be a URL on your customer's website, on your website. I have it in a public S3 bucket, but it could be anywhere, as long as it's accessible to Voiceflow. Then the real core of the component really is this JavaScript. And what this does is it takes the JSON which it gets there and converts it into something that Voiceflow can understand, which also happens to be JSON. And then it presents it to the user using this custom action step. This is the thing that actually shows the buttons that we saw. And then once the user clicks on a button, it comes through here, and this is the JavaScript which sets the appropriate variables so that we can then do a condition on which one was clicked. So I'm just going to run this through in debug mode so that you can see the flow of everything that happens, and this should help deepen understanding. We can see here that the API tool ran and it changed the value of questions JSON into the JSON packet which it got from this URL. Come down here. It ran this JavaScript to turn it into a packet which the custom action step can understand. And the result is that it shows these buttons. What's going on in here, though, is that it is choosing, currently it is choosing 4 at random to display to the user out of the possible 20 questions that we actually have. And it is also, at the same time, filtering any that have been pressed, that have been clicked on previously. So if I choose what role does the observer play in quantum experiments, the next time it comes round, this question will not appear. And actually, we could do that 20 times, and that question will never come back up until it essentially runs out of questions which haven't been answered yet. Okay, so it kind of loops around. But the key thing is here that you could carry on clicking these, and it will always try and show at least 4 questions which haven't been shown before, but if it has to, it will go ahead and show the ones that have been shown before in order to maintain the number. Let's have a quick look at the JavaScript here. So initially, we just initialize some variables. Very important, if you have a Voiceflow variable, Voiceflow variables get defined here under content and variables. I've put all of the variables to do with this button cycler in the button cycle folder, so it should be fairly obvious what is needed. But you can access Voiceflow variables directly just by referencing them right here in the JavaScript. So if I wanted to use one of those variables, I think JSON error is one of them, then I could do something like this and have something happen, and that would be the value of that variable within Voiceflow. Very important, if you do have a Voiceflow variable, do not define it in JavaScript like this, otherwise the value of it will get clobbered and the value won't be what you expect within the code. By the way, little problems like these I've kind of learned the hard way, and you'll notice here that I have wrapped most of my code, most of the business end of the code, in fact all of it, in a try-catch block. And the reason I've done that is because the error reporting for JavaScript blocks in Voiceflow is pretty bad. Unfortunately, you can't. So if you're familiar with JavaScript in browsers, you can't do things like this. It doesn't log anywhere. So this is my solution. I wrap everything in a try-catch block, and then I then set a Voiceflow variable called JSError to the error string, and then I return error. And what that means is that Voiceflow will pick up that return value, and when it exits, it will, as long as you create a path that matches it, it will run down here. I have tried using the fail path, which would see the logical one to use, but sadly it didn't give me the error. So this is what I've settled on, and then this way, if anything goes wrong, I know about it, and it also reports the error to me, so I'm not left guessing. If anybody knows of a better way of doing that, please do comment down in the comments. I'd love to know a better solution. That just seems a bit clunky to me. But going back to the code, first of all, we're checking that questions JSON has some kind of value. What is questions JSON? Well, it's what the API step reads all of this JSON into. So we just check it's a string and then we try and parse it. that gets set to questions data, which, as you can tell from the fact that we are initializing it in the JavaScript, is just an internal variable local to this JavaScript. We then check for a variable called parsed buttons pressed, which is actually getting its value from button pressed. So this is where we record what buttons have already been pressed, if any, but this is fundamentally an array. So another thing worth pointing out here is that, as I mentioned, we can access any of these variables by just calling them by name within the JavaScript. However, only string variables are actually supported within Voiceflow. So we can't have things like lists or hashes, if you're familiar with Python, or indeed things which apparently store JSON, unless we convert them into a string. And that is why we're doing this. Okay, we have to JSON parse so that it understands it then as JSON rather than just a string. And if we do set any variables, then we need to run what's called a JSON.stringify to encode that into a string, which can then be stored into a Voiceflow variable. So that's what's going on there. And this is some code to validate that the Voiceflow variable actually has a value. And then once it knows that, it will try and parse it as JSON. This is a little function which reformats the JSON coming in to be JSON that is compatible with the custom action step that we have later. And then you can see here and here that we start our commands, that we start the code to decide which buttons actually go into what's displayed to the user. And we take into consideration the available buttons and also the pressed buttons so far. So buttons that the user has clicked on already. We then check how many buttons are available to us. And then we initialize this buttons to show list. And we just do some checking around how many buttons, the number of buttons which are available, because you can see there that button count is equal to the available buttons length. And we compare it here to max buttons, which is actually defined up here. So this is how we can change how many buttons are shown to the user at once. 4 seems a reasonable number to me. You could change it if you wanted to. We could put in 10 in here, or we could put in 3, whatever you want, but that's the place to change it. Now, this deals with the use case that actually we have more buttons to choose from than the number of buttons we wish to display. However, if that's not the case, in other words, we have less buttons to choose from than we want to display, then it will go through the pressed buttons data and it will essentially, here it is generating a random number to randomly pick one of the ones that have already been pressed to include that in the buttons which will display to the user. And then here we actually compile that object, which the custom action will use. And then we make sure that we set that to a variable called button dynamic, which is what the custom action is going to display. Okay, so if we come back now to the flow, we can see here, so assuming everything goes right, then we'll head out on this default path here, and it will go into our custom actions. I'm moving myself over there. You can see here that the action body is the button dynamic variable, which we set in the main code. At this point, it waits for the user to click a button. And then after it's detected that a button has been clicked, it only has one route here, and it is the default. So it will always come down here. It will run this JavaScript. So let's have a look at the JavaScript which runs after the user has clicked a button. So there is this variable called last event that is already defined in Voiceflow as default, and it holds, in this case, the last button that the user will have clicked on. So we can get access to the ID. When I say the ID, I mean this value here via last event type. We just put in a little bit of error checking there, just in case something goes wrong. We can say no type found. We could test for that later. But what we also do, as you can see here, is that we add, so we JSON decode, or we parse the JSON out of the buttons pressed variable, which again is a voice flow variable, and we add to it the button that was selected. So this is how it knows which buttons have been clicked on and which haven't. And then we stringify that. This is what I was talking about. We stringify that so that it will retain its state within Voiceflow, and the next time it's run, it can take that into consideration. Once again, I wrap this in a try-catch, essentially so that I can catch any errors and actually understand what the errors are. So that's it for today. If you have any comments or suggestions, please pop them down below. I always try and respond to all of them. I've been getting a lot of comments and likes recently, and I really do appreciate it. Everybody, thank you so much. If you found this useful and you'd like to see more, please remember to like and subscribe. Till then, take care, stay curious.